Did you just buy a Fujifilm camera? Whether you're a beginner, starting fresh with photography, or a professional that just made the switch, you need to get some lenses for that camera. And in this video, I'll go over my top 5 lenses for Fujifilm, which I find absolutely invaluable. And also, at the end, I'll cover a few cheaper alternatives for every lens listed. Now, the great thing about Fujifilm is that every lens on this list can be bought for a very reasonable price. So you aren't going to be spending like 10 grand on a solid lens setup like you would if you were shooting with Canon or Sony. Now, I've wanted to make this video for well over 3 months now, but I wanted to get the individual reviews for every lens that's on this list made and uploaded onto my channel so that I could link them from this bigger overarching guide so that you guys can get a more detailed look at any lens that I list today. So without further ado, let me go over a few things to give you some context as to why I picked what I picked. So I'm a professional photographer based here in Melbourne, Australia, and my focus is on portraiture and event photography. As such, there aren't any crazy ultra wide or super telephoto lenses on this list because I just don't really use them. And also, before we start, be sure to subscribe to see more great photography content. So this list will be in descending order, but I love every lens on this list so much and they all get used heaps. So it's been very difficult for me to actually come up with this ranking, but let's waste no more time and get started with the 5th best lens for Fujifilm, and that would have to be the 50mm f1.0. So this big boy of a lens is a real technical marvel. It sucks in so much available light and its size is absolutely enormous. If you want the real bokeh king for Fujifilm, look no further than this lens. It's tack sharp even at 1.0, even with its stupidly shallow depth of field, and the out of focus backgrounds just look exceptional. One of my very first videos I ever made on this channel was a review of this lens, and while the video is very average, in fact it's actually my least favorite video I've ever made, the lens remains an absolute favorite of mine, and I use it all the time for portraits, and it's also amazing for nightclub work because you just suck in so much light with that 1.0 aperture. I would say the biggest downside to this lens would really have to be its enormous size and its price, but if you really want the absolute best of the best, then the 50 1.0 is, I think, just unbeatable for the very specific applications in which it excels in. So moving on to number 4, this was a tough choice between the number 3 pick because I think they're both so excellent, but I'll have to put the 90mm f2 here. So the 90mm f2 is just amazing. It's compact, sharp, and insanely fast to focus with, and the bokeh is just exceptional too. But while the lens itself is probably Fuji's most sharpest and most fast focusing lens, 135mm full frame equivalent is very tight, and it really makes it a little bit tricky to use for most things. So don't get me wrong, I absolutely adore this lens, and if you're after technical perfection, you really can't go wrong with it. But given that with this list, I'm also factoring in versatility, I can't really put this lens above number 3. And speaking of number 3 is the 16 to 55mm f2.8. Yes, this is the only zoom on this list, and for good reason. It's the best zoom I've ever used. I love this lens so much, and I've even made a video about how it's probably the only lens you'd ever need for Fujifilm. But while it is versatile, it does have its drawbacks, which meant that I didn't want to put it at number 1. So the biggest issue is its size. This lens is just a little bit too big to be used as an everyday lens, especially on a smaller camera like the X Pro or XE line. On something like the X-H2S or the X-T5 with a grip, this lens is great, and it is my go-to video lens. The autofocus performance is the absolute best I've ever seen on Fuji for video, but I do feel like one of the biggest benefits of Fujifilm is just the fact that the bodies in general are a little bit smaller, and it's just a lot more compact and just easy to use. And the 16 to 55 2.8, while it is a phenomenal lens, it's quite large, and I would say that unless you're doing professional work with it, you probably don't really need to get it. It's probably like overkill for most people, but if the size doesn't bother you, and you just need the best zoom that is available for Fuji, then that's absolutely the one to go for. And it's invaluable to my work, and I use it for so many different applications, but most notably, I use it as my go-to video lens coupled with my X-H2S. Now, for number 2. So this was again a difficult choice because I love both this lens and the number 1 pick so damn much, but number 2 I would have to say is the Zeiss 2 at 32mm f1.8. Yes, this is the only non-Fujifilm lens on this list, and like every lens on this list, it is one I will never be getting rid of. This is the lens that made me switch from Canon to Fujifilm, and it is just exquisite. The planar design renders images with a glorious Zeiss pop that has to be seen to be believed. It's aesthetically stunning, and it's also really, really compact. This is a lens which I think just sings on older Fuji bodies, and I'm actually currently testing it with an X Pro 1, review for that coming very, very soon. But together they're like a match made in heaven. But it's also really exceptional on the more modern Fuji bodies too, having absolutely no issues resolving the 40 megapixels that the X-T5 has. And I would say really honestly, my only real gripes with this lens, hair in my eye. So the only real gripes that I have with this lens is just that the autofocus is unfortunately not the best. And it can sometimes misfocus in like the easiest situations, which is really why it's not number one on this list. And as for number one, well, you probably saw it coming, but it's the Fujifilm 18mm f1.4 WR. This is, without a doubt, probably the best lens Fujifilm has ever made. And it's probably one of the best lenses Fujifilm will make for a very long time coming. If you saw my recent video regarding how 28mm is the perfect focal length, you'll know that I have a huge sweet spot for 28mm lenses, and this one is just unbelievable. In my full review of this lens, I even compare it to the Leica Q's 28mm f1.7 Summer Lux lens, and you can see just how unbelievably close it is. For a lens which costs just over $1,000 Australian dollars, this lens presents such fantastic value for money, and it's my go-to event photography and general walk-around lens. The autofocus is basically magic. It's razor sharp at all apertures, and I adore this thing so much. To be honest, I could very comfortably shoot basically anything with this 18mm and the Zeiss 32mm. That's like literally all I need. But all right, let's go over some cheaper alternatives to these picks, because the great thing about Fuji is you can get some really great glass no matter what your budget is. So even if you don't have thousands of dollars to spend on a lens, there are still really good options available. So when it comes to the 50mm f1.0, my sort of cheaper alternative that I would say is like almost as good, like 90% as good basically, is the original 56mm f1.2. So this is a lens that is special in its own right, and it could honestly interchange with the 51.0 depending on what you value from a lens. I would say that the difference between the aperture 1.2 and 1.0 is not that big, and it's still plenty sharp. But for me personally, I just prefer the 50mm focal length, just that little 6mm wider. I do kind of like that a little bit more. I do also think that the 51.0's autofocus is just a little bit more reliable, and the images, they're a bit better. Like, it's definitely a better lens. It's definitely an improvement over the 56-1.2, but you know, you can buy a used 56-1.2 for like $600, and I think at that price, 600 Australian, sorry, and I think at that price, it's phenomenal. It's a really good lens, and also it actually has a few things over the 51.0 in the sense that it's actually not enormous, which is really good, because yeah, it's a lot more of a compact lens. I think it suits like the X Pro bodies and stuff. I mean, have a look and see. This is what a 51.0 looks like on an X Pro 1. It looks ridiculous. All right, that's what it looks like. So stupid. But yeah, the 56-1.2 definitely is a lot better on a smaller camera. Now, as for the 90f2, well, I honestly don't know any cheaper alternatives to this lens. It presents such a unique proposition of being very compact, yet long, and with a really nice and wide aperture, but also being extremely sharp with such great autofocus too. I think if you're after a great tele lens, but you don't have the budget for the 90f2, going for something vintage and manual might be the ticket here. So I recently tested out the Nikkor 105mm f2.5, and that is an exceptional lens with beautiful characteristics and also for a very cheap price. So if you're okay with manually focusing, something like that could be a great pick. And again, it doesn't have to be specifically that lens. I'm sure there are plenty of really good sort of telephoto lenses that you can pick up for not a lot of money, and adapt to your Fuji. And you know, with the modern Fujis as well, like the manual focus assist on them is so good that unless you're shooting like really fast moving objects, if you're just using it for portraits or like landscapes and stuff, I wouldn't have any issues using a manual focus lens. And yeah, you can save a lot of money going that route. Now, for the 16-55, the most obvious choice would have to be the Sigma 18-50 f2.8. And this is a lens that I have owned in the past, and I've been pretty vocal about my dislike of certain aspects of it. Most notably, its absolutely miserable video autofocus performance, but I will say that if you're just after a tiny, compact, and very sharp zoom lens for photography, it really hits the spot. Once again, missing an aperture ring absolutely sucks, but if that doesn't bother you, it's a great choice for roughly half the money of the 16-55 2.8, with image quality that is definitely very comparable. Next up, we have the almighty Zeiss 32mm. So this is a lens where the character that it has makes it so damn unique, but the obvious choice would be the original 35mm 1.4 Fuji lens. So there is heaps of debate online regarding which of these lenses is the better choice. Some people vehemently believe that the Fuji is the superior one, whereas others, like myself, think that the Zeiss just has that unique factor to it that makes it so much more, special. But given that the Fuji is like, or more or less the same price as the Zeiss, in the used market at least, I wouldn't say it's really a viable, cheaper alternative. I think you can get, last I checked, the 35-1.4 Fuji is around about 600 Australian used, and the Zeiss, if you can find them used, is like 700 or so. So they're very, very similar in price, and it's really down to personal preference. But I would say that a lens that actually is noticeably cheaper than both of those lenses and is still really, really good is the Fuji 35 f2. So this actually is a lens that I have purchased, and I own this lens, but I have honestly hardly used it because the Zeiss is just a better lens, honestly. But it's really cheap. Like I think I paid $400 for it. Yeah, I think I paid $400 for it off an eBay auction, which is half the price of the 800 that the Zeiss sells for, and it presents excellent value for money. And it's a really, really solid performing lens. So it has way better autofocus than the Zeiss with its linear motors. It's weather sealed, it's smaller, and honestly, you can't go wrong with any of the Fujicrons. They are all just exceptional, and the 50mm f2 is a great choice as well. Now, finally, we come to the 18mm f1.4 WR. Now, the most obvious choice here is the 18mm f2 Fuji. I mean, they're both 28mm, they're both made by Fuji. In fact, they're the only two 28mm lenses that Fujifilm has ever really made for the XF mount. But I think it's actually a little bit unfair to compare them because the 18 f2, it's a lot more unique, some would say worse, rendering wise at least. But it's also a lot smaller. Like that lens is like almost the same size as the 27 2.8. It's basically a tiny little pancake lens. Whereas the 18-1.4 is quite large. That's probably my biggest gripe with it. It's just its size. And, I think that it's just, I don't know if it's really that fair to compare them because it just doesn't they're not the same lenses. I would say that outside of the focal length, I don't think they really share anything else common. So I would actually say the 23mm f2 is actually probably a closer comparison in terms of just sheer sharpness, focus speed, and also, having weather resistance as well. I know it's not a 28mm, but I think it shares a lot more in common with the 1.4 than the 18f2 does. Where the 18f2, I think the only thing it shares in common is really its focal length. That's it. Because you've got the really good linear motors, you've got great weather resistance, fantastic focus accuracy, and really good performance. And I owned the 23 f2 back in 2019 when I had an XE3 when I first tried out Fuji. I don't own it at the moment because again, I have the 18-1.4, I don't really need it, but that lens was absolutely unbelievable. And yeah, I took some of my favorite photos with that thing. It is so bloody good. And in all honesty, it goes to show you just how great all three of the Fujicrons are. You could probably just buy all three and you would have a really, really solid setup. And at the price of around 350-ish Australian dollars used, you can actually buy almost all three of them for the price of the 18-1.4 WR. The Fujicrons are amazing. I think, go for those tiny little f2 primes if you want to save some money, but you also want smaller lenses because they are really, really good. And I think they definitely punch way above their price point. Absolutely. And that is my list. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Are there any lenses that I left out? What does your top 5 look like? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.